Well, good evening. We'll get things underway. My name is Dominic Hardy. I look after the volunteer guides and the education service here at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. And on behalf of the education service and the museum, I'd like to say how pleased we are that so many of you are here tonight for the first in this series of lectures. Thank you for coming. It's an honor for me this evening to introduce Dr. François-Marc Gagnon, who's director and chair of the Gail and Stephen A. Jaroslawski Institute for Studies in Canadian Art at Concordia University. The Gail and Stephen A. Jaroslawski Institute seeks to advance the greater appreciation and richer understanding of Canadian visual culture of all eras. And speaking as someone who's responsible for volunteer guides who work in Canadian art here at the museum, I can say how welcome the appearance of such an institute is on the cultural geography of the city. Tonight's lecture is the first in a series of 6 lectures by Dr. Gagnon that examine the theme of landscape and Canadian painting, and it is the first public event of the Institute. We at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts are delighted to be involved in this important collaboration between the museum and the Institute. Can you hear me still? Did I lose my microphone? I'll speak louder until the microphone comes back. Can you still hear me now? All right. Dr. François-Marc Gagnon is an internationally recognized as an outstanding senior scholar in Canadian visual culture. A dynamic and inspiring teacher, he taught at the Université de Montréal for many years, developing new and exciting courses in Canadian art and innovative research programs. Dr. Gagnon himself is a prolific researcher and has received the Governor General's Medal for his 1978 critical biography of Paul-Émile Bourdieu. Since 1996 alone, he has published 15, let's let that sink in for a second, 15 important monographs and exhibition catalogues on Canadian art, including his award-winning Chronique du mouvement automatiste québécois of 1998. Among his many studies of individual artists are publications on Marcel Barbeau, Jacques Urtubise, Jean-Paul Riopel, and most recently, on Cornelius Krieghoff in conjunction with the traveling exhibition Krieghoff's Canada, initiated by the Art Gallery of Ontario. Recognized for his comprehensive knowledge of Canadian history and art and his unique ability to reach the public, in 1998, Dr. Gagnon presented a series of video lectures entitled Introduction à la peinture moderne au Québec for the Canal Savoir. A strong believer in public education through various media, Dr. Gagnon brings to the Institute a commitment to the dissemination of Canadian visual heritage to the widest community. And in that respect, I ask you to join with me in welcoming Dr. François-Marc Gagnon.
Always with the introduction of that kind, I'm always shivering, because I says people will expect so much. First of all, my English will be a little bit bizarre. You will recognize a strong French Canadian accent. I cannot do anything much about it. And the subject matter of tonight, I wanted to introduce first maybe some general ideas about landscape painting as such, and then slowly coming to my main topic will be tonight one aspect of the group of 7, let's say, especially with Thomson pictures. But first, I will try to put my subject matter in a kind of general context, trying to contrast, let's say, what we could call a kind of scientific approach to landscape to an artistic one. I think it's important to see the difference. A landscape in terms of science, I would say, is environment, basically. And it's studied by one specific science, one specific aspect of biology, which is called ecology. And if you try to define ecology as, let's say, the relationship between one organism with his environment or with his milieu, or more precisely, how did he survive with everything that is given to him, you will be quite close to the first definition of the term was given by Ernst Haeckel, who was I would say, the supporter of Darwinism in Germany at the time, in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, and the creator also of the term ecology. He's the first one who have designated this science. Then after, when the botanist, the English botanist is called Tansley, George Arthur Tansley, redefined the same science, he abandoned this kind of holistic idea that you had in Haeckel, that if you had all the parts of a system, let's say the animals and the plants and the little piece of landscape around, if you had all this, you have more in the whole than if you just had each part. And Tansley was against this idea. He says what we have to do is really deal with ecosystem. And he have created this word also, in which you will have a much more, I would say, narrow type of approach, in which this particular community really succeed to survive, and this one not, and you kind of a process of natural selection between them. Some succeed, some disappear, and there's a kind of struggle for life, if you want, and the one who is the fittest is the one who survives. Speaking even of this community of plants and animals. And Tansley, who was very fond of philosophy and even of psychoanalysis, for a botanist, I thought it was worth mentioning because it seems not so frequent. He's the one, for instance, who wrote the obituary of Sigmund Freud for the Royal Academy when Freud died in England. This was this Tansley, this botanist, who wrote his obituary. And he says, well, these ideas are already long time ago. You see, you can find them in English philosophers like David Hume, for instance, always was already mentioning something of that kind. And indeed, in the dialogue on natural religion of David Hume, you have this idea, I think he take it from the Epicurean tradition, in which you could have a world done by many atoms that are falling, let's say, freely, and then suddenly combining themselves together and creating relatively stable form. This was, of course, the big problem. How come that you could have chaos to start with, and then ending up with form that are relatively stable, let's say, an organism, but also even relationship between organisms. I don't want to develop too much that, but you will feel, I think, right away that if you begin to try to define scientifically landscape, you become very analytical. You are dealing with certain organisms, with interrelation between them, and you try to see how come this one survive, how come this one disappear. You get this very analytical point of view. If we try, in the contrary, to define landscape as a kind of artistic phenomenon, then I would say the approach is more synthetical. You are dealing with right away with a whole, much more complex. And I took inspiration from a French essayist who's called Alain Roger. He wrote a little treatise which is called Court Traité du Paysage, short treatise of landscape. It's always good when you see that on a book, when the guy announced that it will be short and not too big, and it's easier to buy. And he created a kind of neologism in French, which is impossible, that you cannot use properly today. He says basically what a landscape is, it's an essay to artialize. Artialize, you cannot say that in English either, artialiser, to transform into art a piece of land. You have land and landscape. And the difference between them, the land is a given, but there is a process by which artists transform it into art. And he's very fond of Oscar Wilde. And he says, okay, tant mieux, because otherwise I will have to quote you only French author. And so he goes to, he quotes Oscar Wilde to illustrate his idea of the landscape, his transformation into art by artists who take a region and transform it into art. And what he does, it is maybe many of you know it, it's a famous essay where Wilde have entitled The Decay of Lying. always with the paradoxical idea that he's so famous for. And it's in his collective essay, was called Intentions, if ever you want to read it again. And it's presented as a kind of dialogue between a man called Cyril and another Vivian. And both of them are exchanging their ideas, and obviously the one who represents the idea of wild is Vivian. So Cyril asks at a certain moment, but you don't mean to say that you seriously believe that life imitates art, that life in fact is the mirror and art the reality. And of course the replica of this Vivian is already, certainly I do. Paradox it may seem, and paradox are always dangerous things, it is nonetheless true that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. Is it okay? No? That life imitates art, but far more that art imitates life. And, and he gave right away an example of that by referring to this painting of Rossetti, and he says, in fact, he says, when you go to a private view or to an artistic salon, one sees here the mystic eyes of Rossetti's dreams, the long ivory throat, the strange square-cut jaw, the loosened shadow hair that he so ardently loved. And of course, it's exactly an excellent description of this famous painting of Rossetti. So meaning that suddenly, if you begin to look around you, you will see people who seems to look like art, like you have seen already, let's say with the Rossetti painting, you are suddenly a certain amount of women who will look like her, as if suddenly art, life will imitate art, that you will have a kind of model like this, and it will be... And then the conversation continued between both, and he says, okay, maybe it's possible to understand that life could imitate art, because after all, life is has certain plasticity, let's say. But you cannot say nature will imitate art. This is going really too far. The theory is certainly a very curious one, but to make it complete, you must show that nature, no less than life, is an imitation of art. Are you prepared to prove that? And Vivian answered right away, my dear fellow, I am prepared to prove anything. This is pure Oscar Wilde, I love it. Cyril, nature followed the landscape painter then and takes her effect from him. And he says, indeed. He says, look, that what happened with these impressionist painters have made us discover suddenly fog. We never looked at it before, and suddenly since Monet could make a painting like that, you could suddenly understand fog. He said, where, if not the impressionists, do we get those wonderful brown fogs that come creeping down our streets, blurring the gas lamps and changing the houses into monstrous shadows? To whom, if not to them and their master, do we owe the lovely silver mist that brood over our rivers and turn to faint form of fading grace, curved bridge, and swinging barge? The extraordinary change that has taken place in the climate of London during the last 10 years is entirely due to the particular school of art. Yeah. Okay, put that way, it's very paradoxical. But then he shifts toward, I would say, a problematic of visuality, and that it would make much more sense in a way, much more easy to understand. He says, to look at a thing is very different from seeing a thing. To look and to see. It's not the same thing. One does not see anything until one sees its beauty. Then, and then only, does it come into existence. At present, people see fogs, not because they are fogs, but because poets and painters have taught them the mysterious loveliness of such effects. Then, there may have been fogs for centuries in London. I dare say they were, indeed, they're very famous. But no one saw them, and so we do not know anything about them. They did not exist till art had invented them. So it's a very strong prise de position, and I I was surprised to see, okay, I said, okay, this is Oscar Wilde, and it's not astonishing, but you have the same idea with Proust also, which is an author, let's say, a little bit more familiar for my type of culture, my French culture. And Proust, basically what he says painters are like oculists. He says when you go to the ophthalmologist or to the oculist, he says first it can hurt you because he will try a lot of things, and then suddenly he will stop and he will say, "Now, monsieur, look." And he says, right away you see the world completely differently than before. And Proust says, each great artist creates a new world like this. And in fact, it's exactly the same idea than Oscar Wilde was saying. And Proust gives the example of Renoir. He says, after a while, you see on the street people looking like Renoir girls. And let's see, maybe to put this argument in a more modern context, I would suggest that Michael Snow walking woman could be suddenly seen everywhere you see around us. Like life becomes to imitate art, and nature even becomes to imitate art. This thesis, of course, was, I would say, seductive. You have to be careful not to exaggerate too much, you know, to what extent you can to go in that direction. It's a very, philosophically, I could describe this as a very idealist type of point of view. Not idealistic, but idealism. You see, this idea that everything is in the mind, and you could project it on the things. But is it completely arbitrary? Imagine you will be in a group of people who have absolutely no idea of geometry whatsoever. Did in this group of people a square table will not be square? Even if they don't know geometry, or if a group of people who will not know chemistry at all, will the water they will drink will not be H2O like the water I drink, you see. So you could, and why not some people could notice, like Renoir, or could be excited by this type of woman that walk on the street without knowing Renoir. It's always, so in fact the problem is the following. You could have or artistic quality, meaning qualities that are defined by artists that are projected on nature, or you could have aesthetic quality in nature that artists will reflect. You could have the two possibilities. My Alain Roger, that I was quoting first, is an idealist thinker. He sees art as a kind of a possibility of invention that you project on nature, and you transform the very vision of every people. Suddenly they see fog, suddenly they see a woman who looks like Renoir or like Michael Snow, a walking woman, and you are in a different world. Of course, the opposite theory to that, it is that, in the contrary, the aesthetic quality are in nature, and artists just try to depict them, just try to imitate nature. But you know, again, this idea of imitation of nature is a dangerous one, because then you have no more creativity, and it's not very fashionable today to speak of art as imitating nature. You have like a kind of conflict between these two approaches, and indeed you could say probably what is the right thing. It is a kind of balanced view of these two points of view. Maybe sometimes the artistic qualities precede the aesthetic one, and sometimes it's the contrary. And that's why I like particularly the approach of Simon Schama in his book, Landscape and Memory, that probably some of you have read, in which, in a way, by being very close to facts, he doesn't solve the problem right away theoretically. So you just follow suddenly a case, and then you can choose at the end a little bit how it went. And the case he gives is interesting. He starts with this idea of the forest of Fontainebleau. You know what it is? It's about 60 some kilometers from Paris. You have a famous forest there, who was for many, many centuries a kind of chasse gardée of the king of France. It was only, like François-Marc used to call it, mes chers déserts, my dear deserts. This idea of a forest being a desert is a little bit strange, but a desert is what is not a garden. Anything was not a garden is not tended by human is a desert. And so for a big period of time, let's say it was like really a reserve for hunting for the kings and in Fontainebleau. And this forest, of course, I was interested by this time of forest because I thought, my God, the group of 7, I have not forgotten them, I will arrive to them slowly. The group of 7 was certainly interested in that theme and maybe how it was done. In the case of the forest of Fontainebleau, we can say that as a landscape, if you want, it was created by one man. And it was, and we know him, and we know a little bit about him. I will show you a photo of this guy, who is called Monsieur Claude François Denecourt, D-E-N-E, court, like C-O-U-R-T, Claude François Denecourt, who was called le Sylvain. Alors, you could understand why Sylvain, because it comes from the Latin silvus, meaning forest. So he's like the guy who was important in the forest of Fontainebleau. And who was this guy? Okay, he was a kind of a nobody to start with. He had been with the Napoleon War for a while. He was even wounded at the time and got a limp all his life because of that during the campaign in Spain. With Napoleon, of course, I've been all over Europe, and one of the campaigns, this guy was involved there, and all his life he had this limp. And he lived near Fontainebleau in the region and never paid too much attention to the forest. Living from different odd jobs. He was a custom officer for a while. He was also selling junks or anything, and finally selling wine, which is a good business in France, as you know. And so he was living there. And suddenly he read a book by another guy with a kind of close name to his, Senancourt. And the book was called Obermann, meaning the man from above. And Senancourt is the first one who described the Alps, the mountain, as being really a site of excitement, of beauty, and all that. And you know that in the 17th century, for instance, Madame de Sévigné, when she was crossing the Alps, was always saying, please close les portières, you know, I don't want to see these horrible mountains. There was no way to look at this. This was like full of bandits and others and all that, so that she didn't want. But this Senancourt was the first one who wrote in his book a kind of very exciting description of the house. But in the first chapter, is a reminiscence about his own childhood, where he says, oh, when I was young, I was going in the forest near my home in Fontainebleau, and I loved this place. It was wonderful. I had so many beautiful experiences. For instance, I quote just a little passage. I scrambled up the slope that were still covered in darkness, soaked myself in the dew-drenched heather, and when the sun finally appeared, I was saddened by the gathering brightness that preceded the dawn. I love best the hollows, the dark valleys, the thickest of the wood. And Denecourt, this guy, read this thing and he says, my God, I live just nearby. Why I don't look at it? And so he began to walk. Simon Chama says he invited hiking. He's the first man who invited hiking. For a man with a limp, this is quite an achievement. And so he began to walk like this in the forêt Fontainebleau, and then to mark with the paint, blue paint, little arrows here and there to remember where he went. And he was looking for, let's say, a grotto or a beautiful oak tree or another certain vista, and a little bit like in the Guide Michelin. I don't know if you have seen the Guide Michelin, but you have road like this, and then suddenly you have these little stars telling you this is where you should look for a beautiful landscape. You see? And we're always asking ourselves which angle we should be. But anyway, so a little bit like that. He was going from place to place, and he did that like this alone, if you want. He was looking at the forest, if you want. And like Chama says, he says, from the shapeless, indeterminate mass of topography, he will carve roots determined only by the pleasure it will give to the senses, the uplift it could supply for the spirit, jaded by the polluted vanities of the city. And so he will suddenly see. And indeed, you will see the Barbizon painters will follow Duncourt walks like this. Some of them were quite big, 15 kilometers or things like that. It was, for a limping man, again, this is wonderful. So, for instance, Theodore Rousseau, it has been established that many of his paintings follow la promenade numéro 1 of Duncourt. You see, there was many, there was 10 of them. And for instance, if I have another, well, I have an example of this beautiful oak tree that Duncourt have isolated in his promenade, and he says, you should stop there and should look at this thing. This is a photo of him in the forest. I think not a photo, kind of painted photo, if you want, a photo highlighted with aquarelle of him on the left, and then an example of this Theodore Rousseau painting, a painter linked to the Barbizon school. But Duncourt was not only a man who walked, he had suddenly, he said, hey, there's some money to do with this. And he created suddenly a kind of tourist attraction with the Fontainebleau forest. He organized it very well with, you will receive at the chateau first with vin à volonté. This is wonderful to start the day. Maybe you don't go too far. And then you have then a kind of platform for people who don't walk that could look at le chêne ici, la grotte là-bas. They were all organized like this. He had even a man who gave a demonstration how to take vipers, you see. And so everybody was scared. It was perfect. There was a lady also selling l'eau de Poitiers, de Diane de Poitiers. You see, I don't know what it was, a perfume or something. Anyway, a lot of tourist attraction like the Grand Hotel, auberge and everything. And it became a real business. It became a touristic attraction. Then if you reflect, okay, I just told you the story a little bit like that. If you reflect exactly what's happening there, you have a guy who probably will say, well, I was attracted by the aesthetic quality of the forest. I saw a beautiful sight, and I want people to agree with me and to think, really, this is good, this is right. But on the other hand, you have read Senancourt before. You have read somebody who have probably made him aware of this. So you have all this art preceding nature, or nature preceding art. You have really, when you touch a real case like Duncourt, it seems very intricate. Like the two things are possible. It could be enthusiastic by some aspect of the forest, who indeed could be described as beautiful. And on the other hand, he may probably not have seen them if he didn't read before this romantic author who was very enthusiastic about the forest. And then after Duncourt, of course, all the painters who follow in his step could say, well, we see him through his eyes. But remember that the Barbizon school were very realistic type of painter. They were naturalist painters. So they claim we just paint what we see, and we don't want to interpret too much. Even when Monet, for instance, young Monet, when he will want to make his first really ambitious painting, like the one you see, a sketch of it that you see here, because I think his plan was to make a painting of 5 meters on 7 meters, so it's really huge. It was a kind of a response to Manet, Déjeuner sur l'herbe. He wanted to make his own Déjeuner sur l'herbe. He went to Fontainebleau. At the time, and at the time he was influenced by Courbet also, and you could say that he had also this attitude that Fontainebleau is beautiful, you have to represent it as it is and all that. But he's like one of many painters that precede him and have created in a way this forest as a landscape. You see that this artificialization process, or this transformation into art, was done like this by people, by taking a decision, by seeing some things, not seeing other things, and having a kind of, I would say, a problematic of visuality. I just give you 2 examples of the approach of this Theodore Rousseau, because he's a very typical of this Barbizon school. You see of the forest, like, for instance, a pool in the forest like this, that is described, of course, by critics at the time, like very quieting, very beautiful. You can lose yourself in this, regain your spirit, if you want, and then rejuvenate yourself. This is the romantic idea of what nature can do. And there was also another advantage, I would say. I don't remember if I put, no. another advantage of this type of landscape for them, it was they were able to present the forest as a kind of Arcadia, a kind of a beautiful place, but modern also. So instead of Corot was still putting some nymph and some personage from the antiquity, but with Theodore Rousseau and the Barbizon School, they take personages as they are. You see, for instance, these people gathering wood in the forest. By the way, this was, of course, a little bit forbidden at the time, so especially during the time of the kings. There was no way to be inside of the forest to gather wood or to hunt rabbits or things like that. You were punished for that. But there was always trouble with that. There were bandits hiding there. But then these people are rather innocent. They were going to gather some wood and all that. And in a way, they play the role of the nymph in Corot picture, but in a more modern way. So it was, I would say, these people were really creating this landscape. And for, let's say, for any forest painter of after, it will be like a challenge, like a model. It will already organize certain type of view and all that. Okay, finally, I arrived to the group of 7. Okay. With this huge introduction, okay, how can you artificialize or transform into art the Canadian landscape? It could seem like a ridiculous question, but in fact, Jackson, who painted that this early spring in Georgian Bay, tell a story that is quite revealing, I think, anyway. It is in a kind of not so easy text to find. Let's see, a painter who's called Kathleen Daly, was the wife of Mr. Pepper, who was also a painter, like second generation group of 7. Anyway, this Kathleen Daly, who is also a painter of considerable merit, have written a little essay on James Wilson Morris. And she asked Jackson to make the preface of this book. Okay. And then it's there that Jackson tells the story. He says, when we begin to paint, people were thinking that there's nothing, it's impossible to paint Canada. It's not interesting. It's, first of all, there's nothing to see, and it's snow. There's no subject matter. And he quoted an old lady of his acquaintance that was a collector of European art. He says he's second grade, but nevertheless, our house was full of that. And her comment was the following: it's bad enough to have to live in this country without having picture of it on your wall. And he says then, this was our problem. He says, how do you paint things that where people have absolutely no feeling to the aesthetic quality of nature in Canada? Okay, that was, I think this was in a way the problem of the group of 7. What do we do? How we start? And Jackson, I think very honestly, gave homage right away to 2 painters that have preceded them, and he says, we have created even the very possibility of painting Canada. And he said, okay, James Wilson Morris, that you have on the left, this is it looks a very famous painting, but it's less familiar than you think. This is the sketch for the ferry. The ferry is a painting done in 1907 by Wilson Morris, but this is a little sketch. It's big like this, more or less, and it's at the National Gallery, like the other one, but it's done on wood, and I think it's more fresh in a way. It's done really on the spot, and it has this kind of freshness that you have less in the big painting, who's more with rose, taint, and this kind of thing. The other is Maurice Galbraith Collin, that have a very unusual point of view on the Quebec Cap au Diamant. It's like you see the lower city on the bottom, and of course the river is still almost frozen, and kind of night scene like this. It's quite an interesting painting. And Jackson gave homage to these 2. He says they were the first to really try to represent the landscape as we see it. And indeed, if the popular painting of the time was painting of that kind, I tried to find, because Jackson speaks always negatively of these Dutch painters that apparently our Canadian collector was very fond of. See? And he quotes many of them, but they are very difficult to find slides about them, but probably we have reacted so much against it, the art historians don't want to see them anymore. Anyway, I found one example of these type of pictures that were collected here by our rich people of the time, and this is Anton Mauve, who is at least a little bit known because of Van Gogh. Van Gogh liked him, and you may have seen his picture that represents a kind of apple tree, a little tree, and it's called Hommage to Mauve, Souvenir de Mauve, because Mauve have died, and Van Gogh wanted to give a kind of homage to him. So what it is, it's called Cows. And what it has with Canadian landscape is absolutely nothing, a kind of flat landscape with the eternal cows, eternal Dutch women who were going with wooden shoes. And there was all collectors of some consequence had these paintings on their wall. And of course, if it's this what you like, you cannot look at even the Colin or the Maurice painting. You don't see them, you just oppose. Like Jackson, to quote him again, he says, there was nothing to paint in Canada. The light was harsh, the forest ragged, and the landscape crude. And that was it, you see. Instead of that, we like these little shadowy things, and that's it. He says, indeed, the two solutions that we had before Colin and James Wilson Morris could be illustrated, let's say, by Cornelius Krieghoff, meaning then the model that Krieghoff referred to is so European in a way that it could be painted maybe in Holland, in Germany, everywhere, that you don't recognize anything specific of here, or it could be like Horatio Walker, let's say, again with oxen to the abreuvoir, like this, like he showed, a very academic type of painter in which I would say these painters safely go back to European model and propose that as Canadian painting. He said the real issue was to do something with this forest ragged, with this landscape crude, and with this light harsh and all this. How can you do that? And I think what was so important with them, it is when you want to aestheticize like this, when you want to transform into art some landscape, it's important to create a language for it. I think the problem is really at that level, that you will find the right language to express what you want to say, even in terms of words. And indeed, these words, harsh, ragged, crude, and untidy, are in fact aesthetic characterization of the landscape. Yeah, you will see yes, but it are negative. But I think what the group of seven tried to do, it is to take the same epithet, let's say, harsh, ragged, crude, and all this, and to transform them in positive aesthetic qualities. And through this transformation of language really makes suddenly a Canadian landscape that could be acceptable and could be also a kind of landscape that people will identify with and will make, for instance, the old lady comment about it's terrible to live in Canada and I don't want this on my wall either, seems démodé or something past or something no more accurate like today. And, okay, so that I think is more or less the basic intention. How do you proceed? You try to name the things the right way, and if the terms are negative, you try to find them a kind of positive meaning to them. There was another problem. There's a problem, I would say, of fact. Okay, it's very nice to want to paint the forest, but do we have a forest anymore, in a way? And I'm making maybe a little bit paradoxical, but it's a fact that the moment when a group of seven in the 20s start to go in the north of Ontario and try to find this kind of theme that would be typically Canadian and all that, they are in front of a real problem because the forest is already much exploited. The woods are cut like crazy everywhere. There's nobody who give a damn about environment and all that. It's exploited in a very, very cruel way, in a way. And you could say, well, this picture by Johnson, who is called Fire-Swept Algoma, a painting of 1920, you could say maybe, okay, this is a natural catastrophe, it's a forest of fire and all that. But I have two I would say, in a way, incredible documents, 2 photos taken by Tom Thomson himself that were revealed, I would say, a few years ago by Dennis Reed, in a kind of small little publication, and they are really, indeed, they ask the problem at the, I would say, at the bottom. Where is the forest? You know, so it's a photo. It's like if you just slide a little bit his camera, he photographed this place first, and then this old guy. We know who he is. He was a man called Tom Watty, and it seems that Thomson knew him. He was a ranger, let's say, in the Algonquin Park. You know where it is. This is north of Ontario, a little bit northeast of Ontario, a huge park like this that normally should be a reserve where you don't touch anything, but were already exploited. One of the things that the rangers were doing there, it was to control the cutting of the wood, and then all the piece of wood were put on the Petawawa River and brought slowly toward the south and finally to Toronto or to the mills to make paper and all that. So this was their job in a way. They were not there to protect the forest, they were there to see that everything goes orderly and set it there. Thomson, for instance, will work as a ranger like this in the forest himself. He will be responsible of the completely in the northwest of the Algonquin Park in a place called Archai, where he will live during a long period of the year and will paint, of course, eventually all this context. But he made some photos, and these photos are interesting because, in a way, this is the reality. And after many years, even today, when you go back in this region, okay, now you have shrubs, you have something, but the soil is still mushy a little bit. So you walk and you feel still all these kind of piece of wood and sawdust and all that, it's still there, see? As if even 30 years or 50 years after, nothing much have changed. The destruction was so radical and all that. So then the problem, I would say, was, okay, this is it's a good theme, but we are dealing here with a kind of a total destruction. What we do with this? And in a way, you see on what he sits. You see the huge tree on which this Watty man is sitting. And I would say that suddenly maybe the intuition was to transform the man there into a single tree, and to have these famous landscape that you will now recognize, I guess, that done by Thomson, where the idea will be precisely that, to treat a single tree like this in front of a lake, of a region, always in this park. This is done at a place where it's called Lac Cochon. Very often, of course, in the north, you have French name like this for all these things, because the coureur de bois was there much before, and so they have left the French name all over the place like this. And so they were there, and probably looking north, and you have this tree in front. What you see on the right is a sketch, and what you see on the left is the final painting, let's say, who was done, of course, in Toronto after. We have some anecdote about this specific painting that I think are interesting, because you will see, like very often in history, you have 2 versions of the same event. Let's say, for instance, Lauren Harris was with Thomson at a time when he painted the sketch. They were both of them in a kind of an expedition in this region of Ontario. And Harris tells the story that way. He said, we were on an old clearing at the south end of the Cochon Lake when a dramatic thunderstorm came up. Tom and I took shelter in an abandoned lumber shack. Okay, you see there's clearing, so there's already a lot of cutting wood, and they have a lumber shack. They're abandoned already. That means that they are going somewhere else, you see, to continue. Then Tom looked out, become excited by the drama of the scene, grabbed his sketch box, ran out in the gale, squat behind a big stump, and commenced to paint in fury. He was one with the storm fury, save that his activity, while K to high pitch, was nonetheless controlled. Okay, I think Harris interpreted the thing. Harris is certainly an idealist type of painting in terms of it's hard to create nature and not the other way around. And what he expressed there, it seems that Thomson was immersed in the storm, but he controlled it. He controlled the thing. He transformed the nature there into something artistic. And indeed, Harris concludes this little passage by saying, the function of the artist in life, he must accept in deep singleness of purpose the manifestation of life in man and in great nature, and transform these into control, order, and vital expression of meaning. This is very typical. But the problem, it is that we have another version of the same story by Dr. McCallum. McCallum was the guy who owned a very nice little villa, let's say, near the Go-Home Bay, and there many, I guess with a glass of scotch, I don't know, but many of the painters then there, and he was a big pine tree there, and many of the paintings were done on his veranda, let's say. So McCallum was quite close to them, and he tells exactly the same story, but you will see it in a different way. It may interest you, he says, to know, or to add, that the West Wind, meaning this painting, was done at Lake Cochon. Okay, we know that already. Thomson, myself, Lorne Harris, and his cousin Chester were up there. It was blowing very hard, and Lorne Harris was painting farther up the shore. The wind blew down the tree of the picture. the tree is no more there. And Harris at first thought that Thomson was killed. He thought that he received the tree on him, you know. But soon he sprang up, waved his hand to him, and went on painting. So this is the other version. So not only you have to try to transform nature, but really to create it, because there was no more tree there. It was completely destroyed. And so it's interesting because, of course, for let's say the theoretical approach of Harris, it's necessary that you have something to transform. So he doesn't mention the disparition of the tree. And McCallum, who couldn't care less, he think it's a good story. You think the tree is still there? Well, it disappeared. Well, okay. So everybody, but in the perspective of Harris, I could understand that. It's art is a transformation of nature. It's revealing of the spirit and things like that. We will come back to Harris in my next lecture because I think it's a phenomenon by itself. But it's interesting to put, to oppose both things. Another sketch was done also at the same occasion, and you will recognize also what it is. It is a sketch for the famous painting of Thomson. It's called the Jack Pine. I think in the previous picture, the tree was what we call the red pine. And anyway, it was, and always you have the same type of structure. You will see a tree in the foreground, a lake behind, and then a kind of dramatic sky behind. In a way, these trees are left over, and they are threatened. Because habitually in the north, the forest will go up to the lake. You see, you will have a kind of wall of trees like this. So because all this was cut and exploited already, maybe one tree was left there, and it's not a pioneer tree, in fact. It's a leftover in the country. And okay, you could... Of course, we transform it as a kind of Canadian icon, and we says, okay, well, this is Canadian spirit, you know, the tree facing the immensity of and the wind and all that. But in fact, it's also a kind of tragic situation, you see, of destruction behind, and just this tree who is left there. And so the Jack Pine, again, repeat a little bit the same theme like this. And as you know, finally, Thomson will make this famous painting, again, working from sketches done on the spot, but in Toronto, of course, in the studio building that this McCallum that I was mentioning before provide to the painter. Thomson complained a lot about the difficulty he had with the sky. He wanted to create a very quiet type of picture, like at the end of the day. And if you remember, if I go back with the sketch, the sky is rather dramatic. It follows a little bit the shape of the tree, as if you see all the brush stroke like this. And in the final painting, on the contrary, it's very plain. And it seems that he took inspiration from Harris, who was doing the same type of organization for his painting also, that you see, that McCallum called it a typical sky of Harris, let's say like a pattern sky of Harris, that Thomson. have borrowed from him. And he was not completely happy with it. You see by many layers of painting finally to get to this feeling. The other thing he did, but it's hard to see maybe in this reproduction, some part of the tree are painted first in red. And then overlaid to this red painting, you have the dark spot that you see, or the green spot. This is a kind of system also to create more flatness to the picture. Certainly, one of the tendency of Thomson and the group of 7 is to try to find a beautiful shape will be a little bit reminiscent of Art Nouveau shape. They don't start with nothing. If you transform into art, very often there's a part of projection of a previous art form, and there's also a certain enthusiasm for what you see. You have always these two things, this kind of art that imitate nature, or also nature that try to be transformed by the art. I think it's important to maintain the two things. If we go now, I would say, in the two directions, what precede that in Thomson's work and what follow it, you will see that the theme becomes almost like an obligatory theme for Thomson and for all the group, in a way. Each one will make his own version of this lonely tree, like this in front of nature. If we go back in time, let's see, with Thomson, you will have, again, a little picture done, sketches done on the spot in Pine Island. Pine Island is again linked to McCallum. This is an island that belonged to him, and he was very fond of bringing Thomson there. He says, okay, this will inspire you and all this. And McCallum was speaking of a kind of what was his idea, let's say, to bring Thomson there. And again, they will see, when you compare the actual sketches of Thomson, which kind of freedom he take in comparison with McCallum. He says, the last afternoon Thomson was at my island. I had planned to take him to the northwest wooded pine, where there is a tree that always has inspired me. A huge old veteran standing out by itself, bidding with outstretched arms defiance to the storms and winds of hundreds of years. We were late in getting started, so that instead I had taken him to southwest wooded pine, an island of granite about a quarter of a mile in length and 100 yards wide, and say 50 feet high. Okay, the idea of a big tree who's like standing in front of the wind for many, many years, was an inspiration for man. This is typical of the romantic point of view of anthropomorphism. You transform nature, a tree become like a man, like a person. And it could even suggest all the difficulty that he had through his life, and the fact that some branches are broken, some even the top have disappeared and all that, but he's still there, still resists to that. So McCallum, definitively, I have a kind of romantic idea about the theme of the tree. But when you look at the picture of Thomson, they have nothing to do with this. In fact, they are much more pretty. They don't suggest the strand in front of the wind and all that. They are more looking for a kind of curves. That is Art Nouveau, in fact. And indeed, these sketches will give birth to more finished painting in which this decorative aspect will be even more stressed than what you see there. So again, you may, let's say people around painters could have ideas of what they should do and what they should create. A little bit like my Sonancourt before with Denocourt, trying to suggest, okay, this is beautiful to look at and all this. But painters also have their own reaction in front of the motif and could follow them or not. It is, after a while, Thomson became a little bit fed up of being with McCallum. He says that this place is getting too much like North Rosedale to suit me. All birthday cakes and water, ice and all that. So he decided to quit there. And what do? They will go again to the Algonquin Park, and then all the group will meet more or less there. Jackson was in Winnipeg, will join them there. Varley will come. And you have indeed a kind of photo of the group in which you see most, not all of them, but really a few of them. Anyway, let's see. Thomson is here, smoking. And here Varley, here Jackson, and here you have Lismer, and here's Mrs. Lismer with her child. And these people will gather all that, and many, many famous paintings of the group will be done right away there in 1915, even before the group was defined as a group in a way. And I will just show a few of them, and you will recognize them right away because they are done in this context. For instance, this Jackson painting, the red maple, that is at the National Gallery. It's very easy of access. Mind you, these days they are transforming the Canadian room there at the National Gallery, and all the time it's a shock. You see, you arrive, oh no, it's not there. It's all in boxes. But anyway, normally it's you can see it. And okay, that was done with this gathering of people in Algonquin. And they will create even the term Algonquin School at that moment. Before, let's say, calling themselves Group of Seven, they will relate to this place specific in Canada. It's after that, especially to the influence of Harris, that you will have this idea that we have to spread out, that we have to see other parts, let's say, like the West or the North in particular. But for a while, the North of Ontario was like really I would say, the essence of the landscape of Canada for the Group of Seven. Red maple was done. Another famous painting of Lismer. My slide is not too good there because it's really, you see, slides with time all become pink. I don't know why. There's a sickness, special. And sometimes they all turn also like Seurat painting with little dots. You see, well, this is another problem. But it's the sky is really blue there. It's not like grayish like this. But anyway, it's also a famous painting. It's called the Guide's Home. And you see indeed a little house with a chimney smoking, like a human presence suddenly in this wild place, which is unusual from the painter. And finally, the most famous painting of Northern River of Tom Thomson was done 1 year after this trip in the Algonquin region, probably based on sketches done on the spot also. And let's say also a less known painting, but in which you could say you have already the essence of the theme that they will exploit so much after. It is this little tree on the foreground, the lake, and a kind of dramatic sky behind. And this is a very, again, a little sketch on wood that they done on the spot with the idea eventually to make a painting. But what Thomson will do finally with this is rather what we saw before, the jack pine and the west wind. Later on, if you continue in chronologically, in 1916, I want to show you another example, as if, I think my purpose is just to show that when we see a lot of them, you become to realize it's kind of a pattern they are establishing, a kind of icon, if you want. And each one repeated with some variation, but it's always a little bit the same thing. In that case, Thomson is again making a pine tree like this with a stump nearby, and there's a clever photographer who believes that he found the actual pine tree that Thomson have made, because maybe you have the little stump also beside, and but again, how can you really be sure this is the good tree and it's not another one just beside? All these attempt to put in parallel, like this photography and painting, are always in order to stress the importance or the interest of the painting in comparison. Other example, like this painting of Lismer, that I will put in parallel with the Arpigny painting. Because again, you see, when you are dealing with this theme, which kind of variation you can make or make interfere in it, it is eventually with allusion to other painters that preceded you. Like Arpigny on the right side have this idea of you are inside of the forest and you look outside, and it's all the plain in the background are very beautiful, are very illuminated, and you would say it attracts the eyes toward the depth of the painting. In the case of Lismer, he cannot suggest that he's in the forest because he's just on a pile of rocks, and it's rather the idea of McCallum a little bit before, of a huge tree that resists to the wind and it was still there. So you have, inside of this icon, I would say there some variation that can be done, and finally, two examples, let's say of Varley, and it's probably one of the, Frederick Varley, one of the last painting that he done before going to Vancouver. And as you know, Varley will be more distant from the group. He will do portrait, he will do other theme that's only landscape. But there you could say almost it's kind of a homage to the group. Again, the theme of this tree isolated in front of a windy landscape. And the last example I had, again, is Lismer, with, again, the same type of presentation. When Lismer presented that painting in the National Gallery, it created a kind of pandemonium. This is difficult to understand, because in a way, when you see the dates of this painting, let's say 1916, 1920, like this one is, 1921, you are quite late in the history of the avant-garde. Cubism exists already, there is already Dadaism and all this. You have, if you situate this painting in comparison to what's happening in Europe, it's like late to make still landscape and still a realistic painting of that kind. Nevertheless, it has created a totally kind of people were fighting about it, and indeed they were discussing if it's the place of the National Gallery to buy this type of painting at the time. And the argument goes like this: okay, maybe this could be a masterpiece, maybe they will be recognized later as such, but why to buy them now when you are not sure that they will turn masterpiece? Mind you, it's not always a very good decision, because indeed if they turn masterpiece, they become very expensive, and then the museum cannot buy them anymore. But there was discussion like that. Another says, in the contrary, are we supposed museums are not a mausoleum in which you have only dead people, you see, that there are sure values and all that, we have to take risk and all that. And in a way, it's the two theory, I would say, in terms of philosophy. You have this kind of Immanuel Kant approach, who says beauty is a thing of general, universal consensus. You have that people, when you see something beautiful, you are convinced that you could share with everybody your enthusiasm for that. Of course, Kant is not a great art historian. The only thing he speaks of is tulips and little crabs, you see, that he liked, the little lobsters and things like that. And he says, but I'm sure I can convince anybody of the beauty of a tulips, you see, that beauty is universal or is not. And indeed, what is behind this, it's interesting, it's kind of intersubjectivity. You see that there will be a consensus who will go slowly from one people to the other, and finally would be universal. The other, who says, no, the National Gallery can take risk and all that, are the theory of that you have in David Hume, for instance, in which he says, no, beauty is decided by the group of experts. These are the connoisseurs, they know what it's all about, and we people, ordinary people, who have no idea of this, and we have to follow their advice, and if they buy the famous dress with stakes by Mrs. Starbuck, okay, it's okay, there's no problem, they know what they do. And you have these two theories, let's say, the beauty as a universal phenomena, but with maybe slowly groping toward unanimity, if you want, and the other, the expert. And we don't have solved this problem. We are still dealing with this. You remember at the National Gallery, again, the famous case of the Barnett Newman painting. All over Canada, there was caricature and all that. And I'm sure for the curators who choose to buy this painting, there was no doubt in their mind that this is a great and important painting and it should be there in the National Gallery, and whatever the cost and all this. But again, you have always this type of discussion, and I'm not astonished in a way, because even great philosophers like Kant and Hume were not agreeing on this already in the 17th and 18th century. Okay, we will finish with that. It's enough for a first night, especially with the very odd hours. I don't know if you are, I'm starving. And actually with me, it's a very good technique to make me shut up because after a while I cannot go anymore and I stop. Okay, so thank you for the attention. And